I just want to thank Westminster Presbyterian. I want to thank Pastor Andrish Coetzee, the Wooster Orville NAACP and Juanita Green, and the Moldstad family, and especially Dave Moldstad, who gave me a really sweet introduction this morning. And especially, of course, because they led me to my wife of many years, like 31, I think. What I'm going to do today is try and talk a little bit about the flag in general, its history, some of the context that we're seeing this happen in terms of the rise of the extreme right in the United States and elsewhere, and then maybe at the end talk a little bit about organizing techniques, some of the things you all might consider doing. I mean, in the end, it's up to you. How you take on the Confederate flag in the Wayne County Fair. But I have some ideas and some thoughts about things that might be done. And perhaps if there's time and you're not bored to death, I can answer some questions if there are any at the end. As Juanita says, I mean, the starting point of this story is certainly June 17th of last year. That is when this young man, Dylan Roof, just 21 years old, walked into Mother Emanuel Church in Charleston, South Carolina, was invited to participate in Bible study with some 50, well, I guess there were 11 or 12 people there. And at one point, after something like an hour, got up and pulled out his gun. One young man tried to stand in front of his mother, who was the first targeted person. She was, I believe, in her 80s. He pointed the gun at her. Her son stood between him and the gun and said, why are you doing this? Why are you doing this? He said, I'm doing this because you're raping our women and you're taking over. He had said separately to friends that he was wanting to start a race war, which of course is what the Klan and the neo-Nazi groups and all of the extreme right groups today are all about. We need to start a race war because that is the only way they believe, that America will somehow be purified, will go back to the Garden of Eden that existed before the Civil War, and so on. I want to say, I think it's important to say about Dylan Roof that this was a young guy who never had any contact, any direct contact with hate groups. He never met a Klansman. His entire radicalization, quite a lot, like we hear regularly about people being radicalized by the Islamic State, by ISIS, took place via the internet. This guy, after the killing of Trayvon Martin, who Juanita referred to, decided that Trayvon Martin needed killing, that the young man had deserved it, and in the course of looking around the internet, he typed into Google the words black on white crime. The very first website which came up was a group called the Council of Conservative Citizens. For those of you who don't know, the Council of Conservative Citizens is the direct lineal descendant of the old white citizens' councils that were formed in the South after Brown versus Board of Education to resist school desegregation. Thurgood Marshall once famously called the white citizens' councils the Uptown Klan, and that's just about exactly what they were. These were people who generally didn't get involved in murdering people, throwing people off bridges, or hanging them from trees, but stood back and silently approved. They were the mayor and the police chief and the city council members and people like that. This group is still there, as I say, reconstituted as the Council of Conservative Citizens, and it is truly a loathsome group. It's a group that says as part of its mission statement that they oppose all efforts to mix the races of mankind, which I think is precisely the opposite idea that the pastor was speaking about from the pulpit just a few moments ago. The incredible thing was, after the murder of 9 black people in this church, almost instantaneously before the funerals had even been scheduled, virtually all of the relatives said publicly in one way or another that they forgave the killer. That's better than I could do. One can only admire a person who could say something like that after their son or husband or wife or daughter or mother was killed. In any case, that happened, and it also happened at an incredibly sort of ironic moment. The day that those 9 people died was literally 5 days before the 150th anniversary of the end of the Civil War. The Civil War, which was supposed to resolve racism in the United States, which was supposed to resolve all these problems, but of course did not. The reaction, the fact that that is the date it happened on, the reaction of the relatives, the fact that Dylan Roof was very quickly found to have draped himself in the Confederate battle flag again and again, taken pictures of himself with the flag and a gun, and put these pictures up on his Facebook page and so on, all combined to set off almost kind of explosively a movement against the Confederate battle flag and other symbols of the Confederacy. It was really quite a remarkable thing. The governor of South Carolina, Nikki Haley, who is a Republican, and who had never spoken an ill word about the Confederacy or the Confederate battle flag in her entire political life up to that moment. Lindsey Graham, similarly, all of a sudden kind of discovered her morals and called for the removal of the Confederate battle flag from the Capitol grounds in South Carolina. I should say parenthetically, about 10 years earlier, there was a battle in South Carolina over the Confederate battle flag, which at that point was literally over the Capitol dome. It was the United States flag, the South Carolina flag, and then the flag, the Confederate battle flag. It was removed, that was 10 years earlier, in a kind of battle between the NAACP, which was boycotting South Carolina, and the state, and the compromise was that it would be moved off the Capitol dome onto the Capitol grounds. Nikki Haley was incredibly successful at getting the legislature to agree to take the flag down, and it did come down. It was moved right off the Capitol grounds and into a museum. To Carol's and my shock in particular, a couple of days later, our own governor, who's a very conservative Republican, we live in Alabama, also removed the flag from the Capitol grounds. And we'd had a very similar case. As a matter of fact, the SPLC, the Southern Poverty Law Center, where I worked in the 90s, sued the state of Alabama over its placement of the flag. And I'll tell you a little bit more about that later. So what I want to say was a movement was set off, and it was really quite thrilling. And I will say that having done this work for almost 20 years now, it was completely unexpected. It felt a little like seeing Barack Obama elected. You know, I certainly never thought that I would live to see a black man elected president of the United States, so it was really quite something to see. What we saw in the next 3 months or so was between 100 and 125 efforts around the country to remove the flag and other Confederate symbols, and I'll talk in some detail about that later. It was really quite something. I will say, because we're talking ultimately about the Wayne County Fair, that one of the remarkable things that happened was that right here in Ohio, the Ohio State Fair decided, in fact, to ban the selling of the Confederate battle flag at the fair. Really quite something. So this sort of brings us, I think, you know, ultimately all of this keeps bringing us back to the historical questions of what the flag represents, what it really is, and how that meaning has changed. You know, what the defenders of the flag will say, of course, is very kind of neatly encapsulated in a little phrase, heritage, not hate. That's the claim, that the flag is just about people's ancestors. Yes, there were some bad parts to the antebellum South, but that's not really what it stands for, and so on and so on. The most recent polling that's been done around the flag was done by Pew in 2011, and it showed, in fact, that 48% of Americans believe that the Confederate battle flag represents states' rights, that is what the Civil War was really all about. 38%, a mere 38% of Americans believe that the Civil War was fought over the institution of slavery. You will hear from defenders of the Confederate battle flag and the Confederacy in general all kinds of explanations that have been ginned up about the Civil War. The idea, as we frequently hear from Klan groups and other groups like that, that this was really the godless materialistic North imposing its industrial system on the South, that it was really a question of states' rights and the kind of, liberties that we all love as Americans, that it was about tariffs and any number of other explanations. I want to say that without any dispute at all, as absolutely any reputable historian will tell you, that is completely and utterly false. There is absolutely no question in serious people's minds what the Civil War was about. One need only read a little bit of the history to understand that, but I wanted to give you a few things that maybe will help you understand why this is so obviously true. One of the things that happened at the very beginning of the Civil War was that the early seceding states, like Alabama, where Carol and I live, sent secession commissioners to the other states of the South, both the Deep South and the Middle South. So they sent these secession commissioners to places like Virginia. What the secession commissioners were there to do was give speeches to the legislatures, saying, what is this all about? Well, come join us. These are the reasons we're fighting. And I will tell you, there's a terrific book by a scholar named Charles Dew, Apostles of Disunion, which in 80 short pages absolutely demolishes the idea that the war was about anything other than slavery. And what he does is quote again and again the speeches to the legislatures made by the secession commissioners. Another piece of evidence, very famous, Alexander Stephens was the vice president of the Confederacy, and he gave in 1861 what's now very famous as the cornerstone speech, in which he called white supremacy the cornerstone of the Confederacy, of the Confederate States of America. Part of that speech, he said, "Our new government is founded upon the great truth that the Negro is not equal to the white man, that slavery's subordination to the superior race is his natural and normal condition." Texas, when it declared the causes for secession on February 2nd of 1861, said in part the following: "We hold as undeniable truths that the government of the various states and of the Confederate itself were established exclusively by the white race for themselves and their posterity, that the African race had no agency in their establishment, that they were rightfully held and regarded as inferior and dependent race, and in that condition only could their existence in this country be rendered beneficial or tolerable." Mississippi, in its own declaration of the causes for secession, said, "Our position is thoroughly identified with the institution of slavery, the greatest material interest of the world." And it goes on, but there is really no question at all over what the Civil War was about, which obviously relates directly to what the symbols of the Confederacy really represented. I want to say, as a kind of aside, that we battle groups like the League of the South, which is very much on the other side of this question. And because I'm standing here in a church, I want to talk just briefly about a guy named a pastor. He runs a church in Moscow, Idaho, called Christ Church. He's kind of a Calvinist on steroids. He is a guy who wrote a book called Southern Slavery as It Was. In that book, it's a little terrible propaganda sheet, and what it says, among other things, I don't have the exact quotes in front of me, was, there was never a better relationship between black people and white people than in the South. The life of slaves was a life of simple pleasures, of good food and medical care. These are literally the things that he argued. He runs a school up there and a college as well, and in fact formed an entire association of so-called classical Christian schools. This guy has been running around the country putting this idea out, and I'm sad to say that it has been accepted in many quarters, especially in the part of the world that Carol and I live in. The reality, of course, I'll never forget that I have an acquaintance, a man and his wife actually, who spent many years collecting artifacts of slavery. I'll never forget, because he came one day, give a presentation at the Southern Poverty Law Center to our staff, And what he brought with us were some of the implements of slavery. So I'm talking about, these slave collars if you were being punished, with these incredible apparatuses around your head. I'm talking about devices that were strapped into people's mouths with razor-sharp blades to cut their tongues up because they were considered mouthy, had spoken back in some way. I'm talking about whips and shackles. It really is quite amazing to see the actual implements, the physical implements of slavery. And I want to tell you one last story, and then we'll move on from heritage, not hate. That very clever slogan was cooked up about 1999 by a group called the Heritage Preservation Association based in Georgia. There's a woman named Linda Sewell, who is the president of HPA, of the Heritage Preservation Association in Alabama, in my state. In the year 2000, in front of the Southern Poverty Law Center, we had a kind of amazing demonstration by 66, it actually was, of probably the best-known racist organizers in the United States. There were people like Richard Butler from the Aryan Nations, people from the National Socialist Movement, and so on. This was literally a demonstration held under swastika flags, iron crosses, Klan crosses, and the Confederate battle flag. Linda Sewell, who was representing this organization, HPA, which is supposed to be, we're not about hate, we love everyone, we're just proud of our heritage. Linda Sewell thought she was being very clever. This was on a January day. January, I will tell you, in Alabama is not very cold at all. Well, Linda Sewell showed up, and the police had completely closed off the block around us with riot squads, and all the demonstrators had to come through metal detectors to come stand in front of our building and shake their fists at us. Linda Sewell showed up. She parked her car about 10 blocks away. She took a piece of paper and folded it and put it over her license plate, so I guess the evil people at SPLC wouldn't be able to identify her, but she didn't do so well. And she wore, I'll never forget, a red wool hat pulled way down over her eyes and a big red scarf so you couldn't see her face. Because we have some very hotshot people at the Southern Poverty Law Center, we in fact had identified every single one of those 66 people before the rally was over, including Linda Sewell. The incredible thing was, off they went afterwards, the whole crew together. They drove up to the Shoney's, in Anniston, I think it is, north of us, where they pulled over. They reserved a room, closed off in the back, a kind of banquet room, and they held a big lunch to celebrate them having told the Southern Poverty Law Center a thing or two. And during this gathering, Linda Sewell was called to the stage and given a certificate of appreciation from the Aryan Nations Knights of the Ku Klux Klan. It had the Klan blood drop in the middle, expressing their deep appreciation for her. We made Linda's life rather miserable after that. We were able to, in ways I would tell you about, except then I sort of have to kill you, we were able to get both still photographs and video of this presentation, and got it the next day, into all the papers in Alabama. And it was really quite a moment, because for us it was, it was a kind of morality play, right? I mean, this is the heritage, not hate people, right? Accepting awards of valor from the Ku Klux Klan. So I think that kind of says what needs to be said about heritage, not hate. So let me go on to the flag itself. Just for technical understanding, let me say, the Confederate battle flag was never the national flag of the Confederacy, right? It never actually represented the entire Confederacy. Though there were three flags at various points that did stand for the Confederacy. There was Stars and Bars, it's called, the Stainless Banner, and the so-called blood-stained banner. What we know now as the Confederate battle flag was the flag under which the Army of Northern Virginia, which was the main fighting force of the Confederacy, fought. It was originally a square flag, and it was a much brighter flag than the others because they wanted it specifically so that the Confederates would be able to not shoot each other, basically, see where their colleagues were on the battlefield. So that's one other thing I should say about it. There are 13 stars in the Confederate battle flag. They represent the 11 7 states that did secede, and Missouri and Kentucky, which were very conflicted states and kind of torn apart in terms of which side they were on. The cross in the Confederate battle flag is the St. Andrew's cross, which originally comes from Scotland and is very similar. You see it on a lot of southern flags. In fact, the state of Alabama flag is just a white background with a red cross corner to corner, and that is the St. Andrew's cross. In any case, to jump on now to, what really happened after the war. A remarkable set of things happened as soon as the end of the Civil War finally arrived. Alexander Stephens, man I've mentioned already, the Vice President of the Confederacy, almost immediately wrote a big 3-volume history of the Civil War, in which the entire issue of slavery was just elided. It just disappeared from the history of the Civil War. So this was the beginning, if you will, of sort of the cover-up, right? It was the beginning of the construction of a narrative about the Civil War that is utterly false, has no basis in reality at all. And, in the time since then, all of these, and he was responsible for some of these things, but all of these myths kind of arose. For instance, one thing we hear very often down in the South from groups like the Sons of Confederate Veterans and so on, League of the South, is the idea that there were tens of thousands of black Confederates, of black people in the South who fought to defend their land and their people and so on, and they really, because, as Doug Wilson argues, it was really, Garden of Eden back then. I think I won't surprise you by saying that that is a lie. In fact, black people were only allowed to fight for the Confederacy in the final weeks of the war, when it was clear that they were losing. Virtually no one did it willingly in any way, and very, very few black people ever picked up a gun, right? They were sort of, they built the campfires and cooked the food. So it's a pure mythology, a pure myth. Another piece of the myth, or another kind of side of the mythology that was built up around the so-called lost cause, was the idea that this was really a defense of Jeffersonian democracy, sort of every man in his land, living close to the land, and, true liberty at the very local level. What kind of happened, in a sense, after the Civil War was there was an unspoken agreement reached, in effect, between the North and the South, in which the North agreed, we're not going to talk about you people, you ex-rebels, as traitors. We're going to accept the idea of the kind of the noble Confederate soldier. And, it was a terrible thing that happened. And in return, but no criticism, right? I mean, this was a nobly fought war and so on, sort of man at his best. And in return, Southerners would accept the fact that we were once again a union, essentially without complaining about it. And that idea held for many, many, many decades. And in the course of that, in the many years after the Civil War, an enormous number of memorials were put up across the South to lionize, make heroes out of the Confederates. We did a survey very recently, just a few months ago, in which we found 1,503 monuments or other things honoring the Confederacy. Most of them in the Deep South, but a remarkable number in places like Ohio, any place you'd never imagine, Wyoming and Montana, where there's a famous highway named after a Confederate general. We excluded from that count 2,600 other markers and memorials that were primarily historical, right, that said this is where something happened, Pickett's Charge or whatever it was. So these 1,503 monuments include, just so you know, 718 statues or obelisks, real monuments. They included 109 high schools, again, not all in the Deep South, and I will tell you that 27 of those high schools are majority black high schools today. So black kids go to school in institutions named after people like Nathan Bedford Forrest, the first national leader of the Ku Klux Klan in America. There are 80 counties and cities in the United States named after Confederate heroes. There are 9 holidays in 6 states, a couple of them in our own state of Alabama, lionizing the Confederacy, Confederate Memorial Days, things like that. There are 10 U.S. military bases in this country named after Confederate generals. Just to give you a couple of brief examples, I think Juanita mentioned Stone Mountain, Georgia. Stone Mountain, well, it was a long project. It began in 1922. They ran into trouble. It was finally completed in 1972. But there is the largest bas relief, deep bas relief sculpture in the world, and it depicts 3 Confederate generals. It's often called the Confederate Carving Memorial. This is a mountainside in which the equestrian statues of these guys is carved. It is 400 feet high. The whole thing covers 3 acres. In fact, it's significantly larger than Mount Rushmore, right? In the aftermath of Dylann Roof's massacre in Charleston, there were a number of demonstrations in favor of the Confederate flag, and one of them was there at Stone Mountain, and it was led by the Ku Klux Klan and the National Socialist Movement, which is the largest neo-Nazi group in the United States right now. A couple of other things about Stone Mountain. This was the site of the rebirth of the Klan in 1915, the so-called Second-Era Klan. It was the first time the Klan ever burned a cross. A bunch of Confederate survivors, people who'd fought in the war, went up and restarted the Klan, and what ultimately became the largest Klan in America. It reached a height of 4 million members by 1925. It's probably also worth saying that the main sculptor, the man who conceived this whole monument, whose name I can't remember, but sorry, Dave, he was a Norwegian immigrant, and he, in fact, was a member of the Consilium of the Klan at the time, which was the central governing body, just below the Imperial Wizard. That monument was financed in large part by the Ku Klux Klan. If you go to Stone Mountain, you'll never know any of this stuff. None of this is written down on plaques or anything like that. I'll mention one other memorial, which to me is probably the most shocking thing of all. There was a small town in Louisiana, Colfax, Louisiana. Colfax is about 40 miles from Gina, Louisiana. I bet a lot of people in this room remember the Gina 6, the 6 young black students who were nearly sent to prison in a schoolyard fight, which didn't approach something people should go to prison for. And that birthed a kind of small movement which lasted quite a year or two and was quite dramatic. So 40 miles away from Gina, in Colfax, which in fact is where one of the white kids involved in that schoolyard battle, remember that started with the white kids hanging a noose from a tree in the schoolyard, was from Colfax. Well, in Colfax, they have 2 monuments. One of them is a big plaque commemorating the 1873 massacre of 150 black freedmen who were defending the courthouse against the so-called Redeemers, right? In other words, this was radical Reconstruction. Black people in the South were voting for the first time, and of course that lasted a very short time before it was violently taken back by whites, the so-called Redeemers, the redemption of the South. On this monument is, the plaque says that it is commemorating carpetbag misrule of the South. This was put up, by the way, in 1951. Then beside it, there's an obelisk saying the same thing. And what the obelisk says incredibly is that this monument was put up in loving remembrance, quote unquote, of the 3 white men who died in this massacre, who died, as the obelisk says, defending white supremacy. So, they understood what it was all about. And that monument still stands today. Looking at the history of monuments and Confederate symbols in this country, I told you how many monuments we found. We also looked at when these monuments really went up. In other words, because it tells you something to understand the history of when these things appeared in the South. Well, there were two great spikes of when this kind of memorialization and lionization of the Confederacy happened. The first one was between 1900 and the mid-1920s, the peak of the Second Klan. In other words, it absolutely coincided. What happened initially after the Civil War was the impositions of things like the Black Codes, the apprentice system, these terrible labor laws, and that resulted in military occupation by the North. And so that the Black Codes were suppressed, but what happened right around 1900 was both the peak of lynchings in the South in the very late 1890s, and also the imposition of Jim Crow, right? The system that would stay in place until very recently in the South. So that was the first period of these monuments going up. It was the time when the Birth of a Nation, that infamous movie about the Klan that makes real heroes out of the Klan, was released, and so on, when President Wilson described Birth of a Nation as like writing history in lightning. The second period was the 1950s and 60s, when an enormous number of these things went up, and I don't need to tell you that it was in reaction, of course, to the Civil Rights Movement, which began with the 1954 Brown v. Board of Education decision, and of course ended sort of formally with the murder of Martin Luther King in 1968. It was during that period, during the Civil Rights Movement, as Juanita really said already, that the Confederate battle flag was picked up by the Klan and used specifically as a kind of response to the Civil Rights Movement. As she said, people were killed, had dogs sicked on them, and so on under the Confederate battle flag. The other thing that happened in that period is that is when the state governments of the Deep South raised the Confederate battle flag over the Capitol domes of their respective states. This happened in South Carolina, Georgia, Alabama, and Mississippi. Now, you will hear claims from people like the SCV that these flags went up as a commemoration, the 100-year commemoration of the Civil War. That is false. In fact, and I will tell you why we know this, we, the Southern Poverty Law Center, in the early 90s, sued the state of Alabama. I mentioned this earlier. And we deposed, in fact, the man who, at the orders of Governor George Wallace, right after Wallace gave his infamous segregation today, segregation tomorrow, segregation forever speech, he testified, or was deposed by us, and said, yes, the governor put it up there, told me to put it up there, and it was a direct response to Bobby Kennedy's Justice Department by the attempt of the federal government to desegregate schools. In other words, those flags were a great big upraised middle finger pointed in the direction of Washington, D.C. So the idea that this was some kind of celebration of heritage is simply another lie that goes into a very large edifice of lies surrounding the Civil War. What's happened in more recent years, in the late 80s, the 90s, is that we have seen historians get far more serious. That kind of unspoken agreement I talked about fell apart, and historians started to look at the Civil War in a much more serious way. And of course, they found the very things I'm talking about. One interesting thing, I remember meeting personally the guy who was the chief historian for the National Park Service, and he told me that, in fact, the Park Service had never had a plaque until 1999 anywhere in the United States on all these Civil War battlefields in sight that said one word about the causes of the Civil War, right? It was always, well, Pickett's charge was down there, and, they turned left at the old oak tree and that kind of thing. It was just these little technical details, but they were not serious plaques. These were not the kinds of things that one should have. They didn't tell you anything about the real history of the war. That has changed. There are many, many new plaques. There's a lot more explanatory material in our national monuments about the Civil War, but that is very recent. So, I want to kind of jump to a completely different topic or idea for a moment, which is just to talk about, what's happening now and what the context all of this is happening in. And when I speak about context, what I'm talking about is the rise of the radical right in the United States over the last 10 or 15 years. This is not, what's going on is not just that, good progressive people are getting together and, trying to right the wrongs of the past and nothing else is going on at all. In fact, these groups have risen up dramatically in the last 15 or 20 years. A part of it, believe it or not, is the British vote to leave the European Union. That is a vote that was absolutely supported by every white supremacist in Britain and around the world, because, it's racial nationalism. I mean, I'm not accusing every Briton who voted for the Brexit so-called, of being a Klan member, but the reality is that's really what it's expressing. This is a movement that is going on. Europe is now filled with far-right, hyper-nationalist parties. Poland has practically become a fascist country. Hungary is on its way. There are very serious radical right parties. The National Front in France may well win the next presidential election, because of a reaction to multiculturalism, immigration, and so on. So, let me say, in this country, we've seen hate groups, what we categorize as hate groups, sort of the Klan groups, rise pretty quickly from about 602 in the year 2000 by our count to 892 this last year. More dramatically, another type of group, another type of extreme right group, what we all used to call the militias back in the 1990s, have simply exploded. In 2008, there were 149 of these militia groups, or as they call themselves, patriot groups. By 2015, by last year, that number was 998. And at one point, a couple of years ago, it was actually 1,360. So between 2008 and 2013, we saw the number of these groups grow up by 800%. That's way beyond anything we've ever seen in 30 years of counting these groups. Well, what's that all about? Well, what happened in the fall of 2008? We elected our first black president. So this was a reaction. I think most people remember what happened immediately after the election, which was, it was very, I think, joyous for many people. And I think really most people felt that way. It seemed incredible. And, of course, there was a lot of talk about post-racial America. And, now we didn't have to talk about race anymore. And the original sin of the country, slavery, had been kind of erased and so on. But, of course, there was also, and I'm sure many people in the room remember, quite a reaction. All kinds of racist events happened. Nooses were hung all over the place. I'll never forget a story about a school bus full of third graders in Idaho on the way to school chanting "Assassinate Obama" a couple of days after his election. But, it was not merely the election of, one black man, a black man and his black wife and their black children in the White House that was so, outraging to so many people. It was really what his election represented. And what Obama's election, in a very real sense, represented was the disappearing white majority in this country, the huge demographic transition that is happening in this country. The Census Bureau has predicted that in about 30 years, by 2043, white people in America will be simply another minority. They will be less than 50% of the population. So there's a huge change going on. For almost all of our history since the colonial era, we've been a country that's been 90% non-Hispanic white, and that's not true anymore. Well, it's 62% white right now, and as I say, it's changing very much every day. Our two largest states, California and Texas, are both majority-minority states. So there's an enormous change going on. At the same time, because the world globalizes and is sort of knit more and more together, there are all of these new forces coming into play, and one of the most obvious is immigration. We see that in the Syrian immigration crisis. You see that in the European Union, and that really, again, was what the Brexit vote was all about, right? A rejection of this idea that all of these different people could live together and make a stronger country as a result. At the same time, huge cultural changes going on. Almost as shocking as seeing a black man elected president of the United States in 2008 has been the advance of same-sex marriage. I mean, if you think back 15 years, did that seem possible? It didn't seem possible to me. And yet here we are, 15 years later, with same-sex marriage legal in all 50 states. And at the same time, for a number of different reasons, and it's sort of a whole different talk, but there's, we see incredible polarization politically in this country. One need only to think for a moment about Donald Trump and some of the things he said to understand that. But also, we live in an era in which, unlike the past, we're not getting all our news, our kind of facts about the world from the same place at all, right? I mean, Americans fought hard in the 1960s over various things like desegregation, but they were really reading essentially the same newspapers, seeing the same broadcasts on national television, and that is not true today anymore. Dylan Roof never read a newspaper, never read a magazine. All his information about the world came from the internet. So if you are a person that wants to believe, as many of the people I cover, that the Federal Emergency Management Agency is secretly running a string of concentration camps into which they are planning at any moment to throw anyone who resists the coming gun seizure, then there are, 20 quote-unquote news sites on the internet that will tell you you're absolutely right. So, without going on about that, it's a tough time, and it probably will be for another 20 or 30 years. One need only think of the political violence we're seeing. Obviously, Orlando was the most dramatic. But, I will tell you, just as a for instance, that just a few years ago, on New Year's Eve 2013, there was an attempt to kill far, far more people, LGBT people, than the 49 who were murdered in Orlando. On that New Year's Eve, a particular man went to an upstairs gay bar, or really a nightclub in an upstairs building in Seattle, it's a place called Neighbors, poured gasoline all up and down the one stairwell going up to this room, this big club, and lit it on fire. There were 750 people up there. That man tried to burn alive 750 gay people. By a miracle, one of the patrons smelled the smoke, was quite close to the door, opened it, saw it, ran down the stairs and managed to smother the flames. But, that's the kind of thing you don't hear on the national news simply because nobody was hurt. It was a scary thing, got a lot of press in Seattle, but nowhere else. So there's a lot of violence out there. The last year has been quite incredible in terms of political violence. Anyway, that brings us, in a sense, back to Charleston and what happened in the aftermath. I want to just give you a sense of the movement against Confederate battle flags, some of the things that have happened. In Alaska, there was a huge territory renamed, which had been named after a Confederate general, Wade Hampton. In San Diego, they renamed an elementary school, which was also named after a Confederate general. In Florida, the legislature voted to replace a statue of yet another Confederate general at the Capitol, at the U.S. Capitol building. It was there. It's a Florida display at the U.S. Capitol. The Confederate flag was removed in Kansas's Veterans Park Memorial. On and on and on and on. I think probably the most interesting was the attempt, the vote by the city council in Memphis, Tennessee, to remove the equestrian statue of Nathan Bedford Forrest, which sits in Nathan Bedford Forrest Park in central Memphis. And there are also the remains. Forrest and his wife are actually buried under this Confederate statue. So they voted to take the statue down, to disinter them and send them somewhere else, and to rename the park. The park has actually been renamed already. The rest is in court. I'll talk a little bit more about that later. But I want to say, for those of you who don't know, that Nathan Bedford Forrest was a famous lieutenant general fighting for the Confederacy from Tennessee. He was famous because he was an incredibly brutal, but also incredibly effective cavalry general. He was a hell of a horseman. He personally killed something like 35 people. Quite incredible. Had 9 horses shot out from under him. Was completely illiterate, by the way, but became this, rough and ready hero of the South. Well, and you will hear a lot about that from the SCV and what a great guy he was, and, what a thrilling character. Well, the part they don't tell you about, the part that is left out, is that before the Civil War, Nathan Bedford Forrest had become a millionaire. This was at a time when there weren't many millionaires in the world, running an infamous slave yard in Memphis, an incredibly brutal place about which much has been written. During the Civil War, Nathan Bedford Forrest presided over the massacre of over 100 surrendering black Yankee troops in Fort Pillow, Tennessee. He stood back and let his men slaughter these people who were trying to surrender. It was really quite amazing. And after the Civil War, Nathan Bedford Forrest became the first imperial wizard of the Ku Klux Klan, the first national wizard of the Ku Klux Klan. Again, you'll hear sort of pro-Confederates make an argument that, well, when Forrest realized how violent the Klan was getting, he disbanded it. Another falsehood. The reality is that the work of the Klan was done. The Klan had so intimidated Republicans, freedmen, their sympathizers, and so on, that it was almost impossible to vote Republican in the South. The Republicans, of course, being the anti-slavery party at the time. So Forrest's work was done. You will see people all over the South named Forrest with a double R, because he's considered such a great hero of the South. So that's a little of what happened. There's another thing that's gone on. Is really a huge battle over the Mississippi state flag. That is the one state flag in the country that still incorporates the Confederate battle flag in 1/4 of its space. Mississippi voted about 10 years ago. There was a referendum to keep the flag. I think it was something like 68% in favor of keeping the flag. It's probably worth mentioning that Mississippi has the largest black population of any state in the Union. It's about 38% black today. And yet, so 4 out of 10 Mississippians are black people, who live and go to work and go to church under the banner of the Confederate battle flag. What followed was, in effect, a kind of counter-reformation, right? I mean, it was a thrilling movement for about 3 or 4 months, but it engendered an incredible backlash. Again, this is something you don't read much about in the newspapers, but we actually counted, in the 6 months after Charleston, 364 pro-Confederate battle flag rallies around the United States. Again, most of them in the Deep South, but not at all limited to the Deep South. So there was really, and there continues to be, this kind of incredible backlash. You see it in some of the court cases that have happened. New Orleans is embroiled in a huge court case where, again, the city council has voted to take down 4 Confederate memorials, and it's being fought about in courts. In places like Alabama, where I live, there are legislators trying to pass laws that would forbid the alteration of any of these memorials or symbols. The Sons of Confederate Veterans has taken a pretty loathsome role in this whole thing. And let me say, just as an aside about the SCV, that, the SCV is not the Klan. It's Sons of Confederate Veterans. It is what they say they are, but, it is split quite evenly between people who really are in it for essentially kind of history club reasons. It's an interesting war. They research the war and so on, but they're not pro-Confederates. They're not pro-slavery. But probably close to half of the members and the leaders of the SCV, in fact, are great defenders of the Confederacy. And one of the most amazing things the SCV has done in recent years was an attempt in Mississippi to get the state to allow the printing of an image of Nathan Bedford Forrest on people's license plates, right? This great Klan leader, this massacre of surviving Union troops and so on. The League of the South I mentioned earlier, I'm just sort of telling you a little bit about some of the groups that are in this world of the pro-Confederate battle flag world. The League of the South started in 1994. It was started, in fact, by university professors in the South. And initially, it was a group that basically said, you know, we're tired of being kicked around, right? I mean, you can't tell a joke about black people, you can't tell a joke about gay people, you can't do this, you can't do that, but you can always make fun of a southern redneck. You know, we're mad as hell and we're not going to take it anymore. So it's kind of a little cultural thing saying, don't be so mean to us southern whites. But it has transformed over the last 20 years now, into an explicitly neo-secessionist group. They want the South to secede again. It's a group, by the way, headed by a man named Michael Hill, who lives in Alabama, and kind of shockingly, for most of his career, taught at a historically black university, Stillman College in Tuscaloosa. Incredible thing. Eventually, they were able to get rid of him, even though he was tenured. You can imagine what kind of an embarrassment he was. He walked around campus with a Confederate battle flag pin in his lapel for years and years and years. You know, this guy, Michael Hill, very recently gave a speech to his people saying, he talks about egalitarianism is a Jacobin heresy, right? It's a heresy akin to the most radical elements of the French Revolution. He says that, what he wants to create is a country in which Anglo-Celts run the show. In other words, Southern whites run the show. He wants to create a feudal society in which different classes of people have different rights and responsibilities, right? We're talking about the Middle Ages in Europe. And he has begun openly speaking in the last year or so of a race war. Right? This is a guy who was a serious university professor for many years. He gave a speech about a year ago in which he told his listeners, his members of the League of the South, that they needed to arm themselves, they needed to get weapons like AR-15s, and sort of incredibly, he asked them to get tools to derail trains, if you can imagine. So here we are. The struggle goes on, but it is not, all of these things are very, very difficult. Electing Barack Obama did not end racism in the United States, just as the Civil War didn't, just as the Civil Rights Movement didn't. Just a couple of days ago, there was a major protest at the U.S. Capitol, led by Congressman Benny Thompson from Tennessee, a black congressman, against Confederate symbols in the House. Thompson has absolutely no chance of getting this to pass in the U.S. House of Representatives. It's out of the question. He had almost no support. On the other hand, the Southern Baptist Convention, which of course was formed in the early 19th century as a breakaway, and it was a split specifically over the issue of slavery. And what the split happened over was the question of whether Baptists should allow slave masters, slave owners, to be missionaries. And the northern section of the Baptist Church said no. And so that's where the Southern Baptist Convention comes from. In other words, it was explicitly born in anti-black racism. Well, just a few days ago, the Southern Baptist Convention came out with a wonderful statement absolutely opposing the symbols of the Confederacy and everything that the Civil War was really all about. There are a couple things I wanted to mention, then I'll just talk a little bit about kind of organizing ideas and so on. One, I think, because in part it's incredibly amusing and also sort of a wonderful thing, for those of you who are into YouTube, go look at Redneck Liberal, the Redneck Liberal. This is a very, very funny white guy who looks absolutely, he's a classic Southern redneck. He does these YouTubes with his shirt off, and you listen to him talk about the Confederate symbols and about the fight over transgender people. He's a charming, wonderful guy. One other thing I should say, another little piece of the battle is, years ago, the Southern Poverty Law Center, one of our first really important early suits, was to sue the Alabama state troopers, which were and had been always 100% white. And I don't think I need to tell you that, the face of the police force is incredibly important in terms of dealing with racism. If the authorities, if the people with guns that can kill you are all white, it is difficult as a black person to feel, that they're in any way going to be fair to you, and they certainly weren't. And of course, we remember the role of state troopers and Bloody Sunday and all the rest of it. Well, that suit resulted in a state trooper force in Alabama that is more integrated than any other state trooper force in America, like bar none. Forget Massachusetts and Vermont or wherever. And yet, those men and women still wear on their sleeve, as part of the state trooper emblem, something that looks a bit like the Mississippi flag. It's a 1/4 of this shield is in fact the old Confederate battle flag with its cross, its Southern Cross, and its 13 stars. So, I want to just say one last thing about all of this is, one of the things we see looking at the radical right in general in terms of a changing world, which is what we are looking at today, is that very often, as the society becomes more tolerant and more open and moves in certain directions, the people who are against those changes become more radical still. So we see that, for instance, very plainly in the same-sex marriage, LGBT rights, right? Where you see, more and more, all the polling shows, more and more people have no problem with LGBT rights or gay relationships and that kind of thing. But, you see as a response to that, not all, but some of the religious right organizations that oppose same-sex marriage becoming more and more shrill. So we have groups like the American Family Association that now say that gay men are responsible for the Nazi Holocaust, which I don't think I need to tell you. It's some kind of weird fantasy, right? It has nothing to do with reality. In the same way, that is very much what we're seeing with regard to these Confederate symbols and the whole idea of what was the Civil War about and so on. And I think it's very much kind of symbolized in the fact that if you think back 15, 20 years, Robert E. Lee has always been sort of put in the pantheon, more or less, of American heroes. And while that may not be a terrific thing, the reality is that Lee was not Nathan Bedford Forrest. Robert E. Lee did not want to fight the federal government, but decided to because his first loyalty was to the state of Virginia. And so when Virginia seceded, Lee felt that he had to join up, and in fact, it wound up leading the forces of the South. By the same token, at the end of the Civil War, Lee was the first one to say, now we've got to be a union once again, and he really did do quite a lot to bring the Union back together. So the point I'm trying to get to is that if you look at these sort of pro-South groups, the League of the South, the Sons of Confederate Veterans, and any number of others, the face of that movement is no longer Robert E. Lee as it was in the 50s and 60s. It is Nathan Bedford Forrest. That's the name you hear all the time. So what I'm saying is that, that's just symbolic of how the antis, the kind of pro-Confederate forces had become more and more extreme. So you'll hear some of them not merely saying the Civil War didn't have anything to do with slavery, but slavery was a good thing, right? The argument that, it was far better for black people to be in America as slaves, and so on and so forth. So, with that over, let me just talk a little bit, and then I'll take questions if anybody has any, about some ideas about, this brings us, of course, back to Wayne County Fair and, what is to be done. I'm just going to kind of spiel off some thoughts, recommendations that we have as an institution, and these are things for you to do, not for an outsider like me. First off, I think probably the most important thing is to research the history of Confederate symbols here, locally, right? When did the Confederate flag first appear? Those are things I don't know at all, but, it's important to understand what the true history is in your community, in your local community. Identify groups, and you all have done that already to some extent in building this coalition with the Orville, Wooster, NAACP, and so on. Letters to the editor. I feel a little silly saying that because there have been a lot of letters to the editor. I've seen already a couple, just being here a couple of days. Talking to the media, right? Talking to them hopefully armed with these kinds of facts. What you don't want, and I've spent a lot of my life dealing with the media, and I've been a part of the media as well. What is really does nobody any good at all is to have one of these stories written where, Some say it's a good thing and some say it's bad, and that is typically what you get in the papers. So, you want to present to the reporters the real history, right? Don't allow them to say well, these people say it's a symbol of hate, but others say it's just a symbol of their family and their heritage. Heritage, not hate. And because you've advanced nothing, right, if that's the kind of story you get. So I'm saying build relationships with the media, get press. It's important, right? Make it a part of the discussion. Build an email list of your supporters, right? So you're talking to each other all the time. So the issue is a live one, right? It's exciting. It's kind of fun. You're doing organizing, changing the world. Set up a Facebook page. Use social media. Do one of these online petitions. There are many sites now where you can go and do a petition about whatever it may be. Change.org is one of them. Petitions.moveon.org is another one. Costs nothing. And it means something. And in dealing with the press, of course, if in Little Wayne County you get 10,000 people or however many to sign a petition like that, it becomes powerful and it puts pressure on, maybe you'll start to hear city councilmen or whoever it is locally speak about the issue than just sort of standing back from it, because of course, the way a lot of politicians regard these kinds of disputes is they're toxic, right? They don't want to touch it. They're just going to get dirtied up by it. They'd rather not know about it at all. Organize rallies, the obvious thing. Contact policymakers. So all of those things are, I don't think I'm telling you anything you haven't probably already thought of, but all of those things are, I think, important to organizing a community-based local movement. The last thing I want to talk about is dealing with the arguments. And I've really talked in the course of this talk about the arguments in general, but, heritage, not hate. That is the one you will hear all the time. And I hope I've given you enough information to talk about that. The obvious thing to say is, whose heritage? Whose heritage are you talking about, right? Certainly not African Americans' heritage. The idea, argument number 2, the flag's not racist. Well, as I've tried to say, the Confederacy was based on white supremacy, and you need only go to the very words of the leaders of the Confederacy to show how plainly that is true. The Civil War was, in fact, about slavery. The idea that slaves fought the Confederacy, I really talked about that already, the mythology of the black Confederates. The idea that, this is a matter of freedom of speech. Well, there I think you have to concede. Look, people have the right to think what they want, even if it's loathsome in this country. That's what the First Amendment's all about. But there is a fundamental difference between some guy down the street flying the Confederate battle flag in his window or on his lawn and having that symbol over a government institution, right? The government represents all of us. The government should not be, obviously, in effect, endorsing, sort of the whites against the blacks or that kind of thing. So I don't think, I think it's counterproductive to try, enforce everybody, who has these views from saying, look, they're going to write what they write on Facebook, they're going to, fly their flags and so on, and that's not a battle you can win. But the battle over government institutions is one that you can win, and it really is different. An argument you will also hear is the idea that, well, if we're going to start banning these symbols, well, people fought to defend slavery under the American flag too, the United States flag. And while that is true, it is only, that is one small thing that has been fought for under the U.S. flag, right? It's not the same as the Confederate battle flag or other symbols of the Confederacy, which were exclusively, fundamentally about white supremacy. That was the basis of it, and I don't think you can make that argument about the American flag. A final argument is that this is sort of politically, Orwellian censorship, right? We're going to erase history because it's unpleasant and we're going to erase it. Well, that I think is not at all what anybody wants or is looking for. The point is to move the flag and other symbols from over the Capitol Dome, from the Wayne County Fair, and into the museums where they belong. I'll say, in Montgomery, Alabama, where Carol and I live, we're sort of at the heart of all of this. Montgomery was, of course, both where the Civil War began, in the sense that the telegram that was sent to Fort Sumter saying fire on Fort Sumter, South Carolina, was sent from downtown Montgomery. But of course, it was also where Rosa Parks refused to get down from the bus and so on. So we have this weird, conflicted history. And they have started, after many bad years, to do some really interesting things in Montgomery. Carol and I, a few months ago, were invited to a party at what used to be the fanciest department store downtown, Cress, it was called. It was a very ritzy store. And Montgomery suffered a lot in the years, and a lot of stuff closed downtown, and they went out of business, and they subdivided this into offices and so on. Well, as I say, just in the last year or so, they tore out all of this, and they're making some brand new project in this building. And as they tore out these sheetrock walls they'd put up, they saw a huge piece of marble on one wall. Really, this was a very spiffy store. And right there at the bottom, chiseled into the marble, is, colored and white, right? They went over the water fountains. So, what they have done, and good for them, is, they're not tearing it down, they're not covering it up, they're going to put it under glass, and it's going to be a part of whatever that building becomes. And we're seeing that again and again in Montgomery. They were about to tear down the Greyhound bus station a few years ago. That is where John Lewis and the Freedom Riders were very nearly murdered by the Klan and a mob of Klan supporters with police collusion. And at the last minute, they decided to save the Greyhound station, little building, and they tore, again, there's some things that have been put up, some sheetrock, and they found the exact same thing. They found the old colored entrance. So they've stripped it down again. And that is the kind of thing that is important to our children, to our fellow citizens, to understand what has happened in this country, to understand their own history. So, what I'm saying, obviously, is it's not about erasing history, it is about understanding history. So that is what I have to say, really, tonight. I think it's now up to you all. Sort of the ball's in your court with Wayne County Fair.